Hope this is working. Can everyone hear me? All right, thank you all for coming tonight. We have Professor James Shields from the United States, Bucknell University, who's going to tell us tonight about Seno'o Giro, a rare Japanese historical figure that I personally haven't heard before, actually, but he is the specialist in this area. And the title is The Moral Sensorium, Perception and Practice in the Radical Buddhism of Seno'o Giro. So we'll let Professor Shields give us a talk, and then we'll have Q&A in the end. So please stick around for the Q&A as well. Thank you, and let's begin. Professor Shields.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay. Usually when I speak or when I talk, I like to get up and walk around, but I've been instructed I can't do that because there are cameras on me, so I'll try to stay where I am. Too low. Hello. Testing, testing.
Is this one work? Okay, this is great.
Okay, how's that? Is that better? Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. So it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I actually have I don't know if this is a joke, but something that I've said before, but it's perfectly fitting now especially. And that is that when I was a child, my two favorite animals were the bison and the owl. And I ended up getting a job at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, which you may or may not know, their animal is the bison. So I always joked, the only place that would have been better for me is Temple, because Temple's animal is the owl, and that was actually my favorite animal. But now I can actually say that to people who are studying at Temple in Japan. This is the talk I'm going to give today, and as Professor Sokolovsky mentioned, Seno'o Giro is a figure I've been working on for quite a while. He's not a famous person. Even in Japan, he's not a famous person. But he is someone who I find very interesting, both for his ideas, for his activities, and the things I'm going to talk about today also for his life and some of the things that happened to him. So my talk today is really coming out of a recent project where I decided I would write the life story of Seno'o Giro. So before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about what he did, just so you have a sense of him. And then the talk is really going to be about how his life and his ideas were rooted in, to some extent, the senses and the experiences he had as an actual human being. Sometimes when we study philosophy, we forget that philosophers are human beings. But when you read and when hopefully you hear what I'm going to tell you, you'll get a strong sense of this person, Seno'o, as a real, deeply human person, not just a mind. So let me jump right in and talk a little bit about who Seno'o was and what he did and why he's important. So in 1931, in Tokyo, not too far from here, at what was then Tokyo Imperial University, is now Tokyo University, there was a meeting that happened on the campus, the main campus of Tokyo University. And the meeting was a group of mostly young people who were starting an organization that they called, and I translate it here, this is my translation in English, the Youth League for Revitalizing Buddhism. And basically what this movement suggested was that Buddhists in the 20th century, in Japan, and maybe elsewhere too, needed to be more involved in politics, and particularly needed to be engaged in working for justice, social justice, gender equality, racial equality, fighting against imperialism, against war, promoting pacifism, and supporting basically the people who are on the underside of society, the margins. So what this movement did was it essentially began what I call a radical Buddhist experiment. And by radical Buddhism, what I simply mean is Buddhists who engage in what can only be classified as radical politics, right? To talk about radical Buddhism seems strange because if you know anything about Buddhism, usually people say Buddhism is about moderation. And it is true that this group was in support of peace. But they felt that in order to have peace, they needed to work to radically transform society, basically to have a revolution. So these were Buddhist revolutionaries in the 1930s in Japan. The leading figure was Seno'o Giro. He was actually not young at the time. He was already 40 years old. And you can see him here in the picture. He's the rather sad-looking gentleman, sitting with the mustache in the middle, in the front. So that's Seno'o. This picture was taken in 1931, which is pretty much the time that the organization was founded at Tokyo University. The young men around him were all students, some of them at Tokyo University, but others at other schools around Tokyo, not just at Todai. And so he was a bit older. Most of them were in their 20s. He was, as I said, 40 years old. He had already lived a rather interesting life, which I'm going to talk about more as we go through the presentation. But let me just say a little bit more about this group. So in 1931, they were founded. Very quickly, they published a magazine, which they called Under the Banner of Revitalized Buddhism. This was published monthly, I think, maybe bi-monthly, over the next 5 years. They were quite good at continuing this publication. And the publication was about a lot of things, but mostly it was about politics and the way that Buddhists should involve themselves in political activities. They also created an annual conference called Revitalized Buddhist Youth. You can see a trend here. Everything is about revitalized Buddhism. And they had this conference every year. And at its peak, the conference actually had, I think, 700 or 800 attendants. So it was it became quite a big event that they held in Tokyo every year. By the time of 1935, they began to affiliate with secular leftist parties. So I'm talking about communist parties, socialist parties that were in Japan at the time. And by 1936, they had 400 core members all throughout Japan. So it spread beyond Tokyo. They had small groups in all of the major cities and in even some of the more isolated prefectures of Japan. This became a problem because if you know about Japanese history, the mid-1930s were not the best time to be promoting this kind of left-wing activism. So what happened, unsurprisingly, in 1936, in December, the special police in Japan, the special police in Tokyo, rounded up the leaders of the movement, including Seno'o. They interrogated them quite strongly, I'll put it that way, and then they put the leaders in prison. So Seno'o was actually in prison from 1938 until 1942. So the war, of course, the Second World War was taking off at this time. He was let out of prison in 1942 because his health was really bad. He always had health problems. I'll talk about that in a minute, too. After the war, he continued to live for another 15 years. He died in 1961 at the age of 71. So he lived a fairly reasonably long life. But after the war, the situation was so different that he wasn't able to bring back the organization. They did have other movements that he was involved in, mostly peace movements, anti-nuclear movements, that sort of thing. But the more sort of radical activism of the 1930s was really impossible in the situation of the post-war. So the movement kind of disappeared with the war. So that's the background about the organization. This is the kind of thing I've been studying and talking about for a while in my work. But for today's talk, I really want to focus on him as a person and his life, as I said, the senses. And the reason I'm doing this, and partly, is because I just finished writing this biography of Seno'o. And you can see up there the biography. It's just called Seno'o Giro's Nikki, his diary. This is a work that totals about 7,000 pages. So in other words, he was a very diligent diarist. He started when he was 19, and he continued his diary throughout his life until he died at 71. He didn't write in it every day, but at least 2 or 3 times a week. Thankfully for me, the diary was typeset after he died. So in other words, I didn't have to read his handwriting. It was actually published in book form. And I bought it in Tokyo a few years ago. I found it in Jimbocho. Of course, you can find anything, Jimbocho. And I bought this. It's a series of 7 volumes. So it's a huge set of books. I read the whole thing. It took me a long time. I got through it. And then I decided that I wanted to write his life story because in the diaries, he talks about everything. Not just his ideas, his politics, his Buddhism, but also his anxieties, his bodily functions, too much, I have to say. Sometimes I felt I know too much information about your bowel movements, for example. So he talks about everything in the diaries, but it's really an amazing source because it allowed me to get a sense of him as a person and also to think about the way that his senses and his experiences really informed his ideas and his activities. So what I have here on the screen is on the left-hand side, I call this the standard reading. In other words, this is the way that I and others who talk about Seno'o approach him. He was a Buddhist, he was a radical, he was a socialist, he was a critic of capitalism, he was radical, he was a Buddhist modernist, which just means he believed that Buddhism needs to modernize for the contemporary period, that it needs to shift and to adjust to modern ideas. But the focus there is really on ideas and doctrine, right? When you read the diaries, what you get is a much fuller picture. And by the way, there are probably only about 4 or 5 people in the world who have read the diaries because they're quite long. But reading the diaries was really eye-opening because I got to see much more. So these are some of the things here on the right-hand side. I got to see and hear about him farming and putting his hands in the soil and what that did, what that felt for him, and how he interpreted that. In the diary, he talks about speech and the importance of speech and the power of speech. And again, I'm not just talking about the ideas, I'm talking about actually the sounds. Something about the sound of a rousing political speech is effective. It actually has this effect on the hearer. He also talks a lot about pain because his life was full of pain. I mentioned that he started his diary when he was 19 years old. The reason he started it, I'm sort of jumping ahead a bit, but it's okay. The reason he started the diary was that his life was thrown off course by a very, very serious lung illness, basically tuberculosis, which back in the early 20th century was not uncommon, right, for people to get tuberculosis. He picked up tuberculosis when he was 17 or 18, and it got so bad that he had to drop out of high school. And he was actually attending the first higher school in Tokyo, which was the place you go to sort of lift up to the elite of Japanese society. So he was on track to become one of the leaders, business, political leaders of Japan, but he was thrown off because of this lung illness. He had this illness throughout his entire life, so he never actually healed of this. Somehow he lived to be 71, but he was always in pain. So that's something that really, I think, plays a role in his philosophy and his politics. He also talks in the diaries about pleasure, the pleasures he has in being with his friends and being with his family. I'll show you a picture of his family in a minute. And also, one of the things I really find interesting about Seno'o is how much attention he pays to nature. And maybe that's not unusual, but he really, really thinks of nature as being a source for political activity. And in fact, I would say he's an early environmentalist because he thinks there's no such thing as political justice without environmental justice, right? And he's inspired by the few people in Japan at the time who were responding to pollution incidents. Japan has had a few of these over the past century. And he was inspired by these figures like Tanaka Shozo. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he's a little bit more famous early Japanese environmentalist. And Seno'o was very inspired by him to think about the politics of environmental issues. And we're talking about the 1930s. So this is, this is 100 years ago. It's quite ahead of its time in a way. By the way, let me say this about the photos that I'm showing you here. These are all actual photos. What I've done, and maybe you'll criticize me for this, I don't know, but what I've done with these photos is I've colorized them. And I'm not sure how I feel about this, because the reason I did it was because I know this is a very easy thing to do now. You can actually quite easily, on websites like MyHeritage and otherwise, you can take old photos, you can colorize them. And part of the reason I did it is because we sometimes forget that the world was in color before before the 1950s when we started having color photographs. So I did this just to see what it would look like, and also because I'm talking about the senses, what effect it would have. And so the photos here, you can see that one of Seno'o. That's him, obviously, as a young student before he got ill. And this is a picture taken in, I'm going to guess, like 1901, let's say. But it's colorized now, so it does something to us. Like when you look at it, it doesn't look like a picture from 1901, except maybe his uniform, right? So again, we can talk about that in the discussion if you want, but I decided I would colorize these photos just to get a little bit of a sharper sense of what the world looked like, right? Even though the photograph didn't look like that, obviously, when it was taken. All right. So the first point I want to say, and I've mentioned this already, is illness, because this is something that Seno'o faces his entire life. And what I'm going to do throughout the talk, every second slide or so, I'm going to give you a quote here. This comes from the diary. And these are all my translations, but I didn't put the Japanese here, but you can trust me that I think it's a good translation. But I'll just read this quote here. And there's another image, by the way, again, a colorized image of Seno'o. As a student, at this point, he's already left his school. So this is him at about 19 or so. I know he looks younger, but he's about 19 years old at the time. So he says, I was born into a family devoted to the Shin sect. The Shin sect is a popular sect in Japan of Buddhism, sometimes called Pure Land. It's a type of Pure Land Buddhism, very popular, very common. So he was born into a family of the Shin sect, raised in an environment steeped in the devout practice of Nembutsu. Nembutsu is just a prayer that people in the Shin sect use to call down the power of Amida Buddha. But then he says, at the age of 21, he's actually using Japanese age there. He was actually 19, just turned 20, but I won't get into that. At the age of 21, a severe illness struck me down, forcing me to leave school and setting the stage for a prolonged period of suffering. He almost died, actually, at this point. Some of the doctors thought he was going to die at this age, but he managed to survive. For nearly a decade, from that moment until I was 30, I hovered on the brink of death. Perhaps it was destiny that I, despite my physical fragility, found a new lease on life through the unique perspective offered by Nichiren's teachings. That philosophy became my unwavering truth. So one of the early conversions that Seno'o has in his life is a switch to a type of Buddhism called Nichiren Buddhism. And I don't know how familiar you are with this type of Buddhism, and I'm not going to go into a long sidebar about it. But very simply, the Nichiren sect is the sect in Japan that has always been the most, you might say, connected to political movements. In the 20th century, the Nichiren movements were often associated with nationalism, with Japanese nationalism. And in fact, Seno'o himself, for a while, becomes, I would say, a nationalist figure, right? But eventually he breaks away from that into the politics that I described before, the more left-wing politics. But he always held on to the teachings of Nichiren because he appreciated the way that Nichiren spoke about Buddhism in terms of this world, right? So Nichiren's writings are all about, in some ways, the senses and the importance of understanding Buddhist awakening in this life. That's a little different from the Pure Land sect, which thinks about the afterlife, of how this Buddha called Amida is going to bring you to a Pure Land, and that's where you can actually practice Buddhist practice. But for Nichiren, it's not about an afterlife, it's about this world. All right? So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that is an early shift that he has during this period. So what illness does to Seno'o is it really disrupts his life, but it also allows him to think and also to have time to think about things that he had never thought of before. Because he has a period of a few years where he can't do anything. Physically, he can't do anything. He's mostly lying in bed. He's being taken care of by his mother at the time. And so he's spending a lot of time in thought and sort of contemplating his life and trying to figure out what to do. So just a few points here on the slide. The illness of his lungs in particular, it forced him away from his trajectory. So he was no longer on that road to success. And it also turned him towards religion. In particular, Nichiren Buddhism was the form of religion that he took up. He also became very sensitive to vulnerability. I think this is important. As someone who spends his entire life in a fragile physical state, he becomes aware of how fragile human life is, but also not just human life in the abstract, individual lives. So he becomes a person who's very, very sensitive to other people's suffering, right? And I don't just mean mental suffering, I mean physical suffering as well. So throughout the diaries, you get a lot of writing about the body as a kind of historical site. And I think in some ways Seno'o tries to use his body as a means towards awakening, as a means towards development. And again, this is balanced by his feeling of vulnerability and his understanding that he might die. In fact, he thought he would die before he reached the age of 20. And what that does to you, right, when you think about something like that. So, the next big event, 1923, September 1st at 9:00 a.m. If you know about Japanese history, this is a big event. The Great Kanto earthquake, of course, devastated Tokyo, partly because it happened at 9:00 in the morning when people had just started their fires, their cooking stoves. And so what the earthquake did, it was I think, I'm out on a limb here, maybe the second strongest or third strongest earthquake in Japanese history, not as strong as the more recent one in 2011, but the epicenter was right in Tokyo Bay. So what it did was it completely destroyed many of the wooden houses. Worse, though, was the aftermath, kind of like the 2011 disaster. The aftermath was worse because the fires destroyed everything that the earthquake did not. So hundreds of thousands of people died in this event. Seno'o himself was actually away at the time. He was lecturing in the mountains to the east, and he felt the shocks. Even 100 miles away, he felt the shock. It was that strong. And he started getting reports on the radio about what was going on in Tokyo. He rushed back to Tokyo. He had at the time 3 children, I think. Eventually he had 5, but at this time he had 3. They were all quite young. His wife, Fumio, was in, where were they? They were near Ikebukuro is where they lived, actually, in a little house there. So he rushed back to Tokyo, but he couldn't actually get in Tokyo because all of the trains were shut down for obvious reasons, because the lines were destroyed. So what Seno'o had to do is walk from the outskirts of Tokyo all the way to where his family was. And you know how large Tokyo is, right? This took I think it took him 18 hours of walking. And he describes it as hell because the city's on fire. He could literally smell people's bodies burning, the hair in particular. He notes that, the smell of burning human hair. More than that, also, he could hear people screaming. And he began to see something that really started to disturb him right away, and that is the scapegoating that happened. And this is something, one of the tragic outcomes of the earthquake was quickly after the earthquake, there was scapegoating of those in the city who were others, in particular Koreans, but also anyone who was politically suspect, especially people on the left. And so there was a lot of violence against people based on the absurd idea that somehow they were responsible for this natural disaster. All those things put together really shifted Seno'o's politics, because up to that point, he was largely on board with a sort of nationalist project. The sort of Japanese imperial state was something that he was supportive of, I would say, until this point. But once he experiences the earthquake, he shifts entirely. And so he begins to think a little bit more about other alternative models of politics, ones that are more compassionate, universal, and not quite so doctrinaire or nationalistic. So the picture on the left, again, this is another colorized photo. It's hard to tell what's happening here, but these are actually people in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake relocating, moving, like trying to get out of the city. And you can see in the background, you can still see the fires burning. So again, this is a good example of a photo. If you see it in black and white, it's really hard to see. With the color, you can have a little bit more detail, but it's quite shocking. So on the right here, I won't go through all that list, but these are just some of the disruptions that Seno'o faces. First, there was the illness that I mentioned before, and then in 1923, this very literal disruption of the earthquake, which shifted his views of the world and made him even more inclined towards a kind of radical Buddhist idea. Another disruption that I think I should talk about is simply modernity. Modernity in Japan. And this is something that I write a lot about because the period that I study is really the early 20th century. And Japan experiences modernity very quickly. Things come to Japan very quickly, starting in the late 19th century. And it's a really interesting time because most Japanese, I'd say, like Seno'o, were very excited by the technologies, by the ideas, by the literature, by the philosophy, all of this stuff coming mostly from the West, some from Russia as well. But there was also this feeling of disruption because there was a fear that maybe Japanese culture might be replaced, right? That maybe taking in all of this might be too much for us, right? So you have this anxiety, I think you feel with a lot of intellectuals, people like Seno'o, who are educated. Let me just say this. The generation of Seno'o were educated so broadly, I don't think anybody in the world could have the education that he did at that time, right? In the 1910s, let's say, 1920s, he's reading stuff from all over the world. He's reading Russian literature, he's reading American, he's reading European philosophy, most in translation, but some in the original. He was reading English, he was reading German, a little bit of Russian, struggled with it. But so all that is to say, he received this very global education, but there was also a little bit of anxiety over how much of this could be taken in, right? So it becomes a bit of a sensory overload. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Japanese writer Akutagawa Ryunosuke. He's much more famous than Seno'o Giro, of course, one of the great writers of 20th century Japan. And one of his works that was actually published in 1927 after he died by suicide is called Haguruma, or spinning wheels or cogwheels, something like that you translate into English. This is actually a very disturbing book, but it's really about Akutagawa struggling with some of these same things and not being able to put together his fascination with Western culture and literature and thought and his own struggles to find a place in that. So it becomes a kind of identity issue for someone like Akutagawa. And I think Akutagawa and Seno'o have a lot in common, and they're actually writing really at the same time. We're talking about the 1920s or so. Sadly, Akutagawa committed suicide in 1927. But you might know him from Rashomon, his most famous story that he wrote and then became a famous film by Kurosawa. One of the ways that Seno'o tries to deal with his anxieties is through meditation. And so I'm throwing in a third Buddhist school here. I mentioned Shin Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, that he was born into. Then he shifted to Nichiren Buddhism, but later on, during this period, he becomes interested in Zen. And the reason for that is that Zen, of all the Buddhist traditions, places a lot of emphasis on meditation. In fact, Zen means meditation. That's literally what the word means. And so he starts to practice Zen meditation, and he finds it actually very useful for him. So let me just say this. Seno'o was very eclectic. He was not beholden to a single school of Buddhism, right? Even though he learned probably most from Nichiren Buddhism, he was also very happy to practice Zen or to learn from any other source, right? And that applies not just to Buddhism, but to Western philosophy and Western texts as well. So meditation for him was a way to, at least at its best, to reorganize his consciousness, to cultivate his attention, and to resist the fragmentation that he was feeling, not just through his illness, but through, I would say, the disruption of modernity as well. And as I mentioned before, another aspect of this is nature, which he felt and saw was also being disrupted. So beyond the more abstract idea of Western ideas becoming, putting pressure on Japanese identity, there's also the more concrete problem of industrial capitalism creating natural issues, right? Issues with the environment. And as I mentioned before, Japan had early examples of this. As early as the 1880s and 1890s, there were already pollution incidents in Japan that created an early environmental consciousness among some thinkers like, I mentioned Tanaka Shozo, who's an earlier figure who becomes one of the prominent environmentalists. And Seno'o picks this up. Partly it's because he's from Okayama. I didn't mention that, but he was born in the mountains of Okayama, very beautiful area, small town in the middle of nowhere. So he's very inakanoko. He's not from the big city. Which is, by the way, let me just mention, quite amazing that this young boy from this small mountain village was able to attend an elite school in Tokyo. What that shows is that even in the 1890s, Japan had a fairly meritocratic system, that he could actually go from this very nowhere place and receive a good education, a very high education, until he got sick, of course, and had to drop out. But this is a quote from 1928. He says, oh, this is actually a picture of the gorge that was near his, where he lived, his small town. That's a modern picture. It's not a colorized picture. He says, a divine beauty bestowed by heaven, a heavenly blessing for all people, is being trampled upon by the profit-seeking of a few capitalists. The government, turning a blind eye to the fervent opposition of local communities, sides with those capitalists. Power plants can be built anywhere, but the Taisha Kukyo, that's the gorge, is a priceless natural landscape. Industry is not the whole of life. It exists for the sake of life. So Seno'o is not against industry, but he's against the idea of industry, creating problems rather than solving problems. Then he says, natural beauty, too, exists for the sake of life. And yet, in its rare uniqueness, why should it be sacrificed for a single power project? He's talking about a project that was planned, actually, for this very gorge, which would disrupt the water, of course, but also disrupt the beauty of the gorge. I mentioned before the soil. So Seno'o also has this idea that he wants to plant his own food. So you can see him going through all the phases of a sort of almost like a back to the land idea. And at one point, when he's, I guess this is 1930, so he's already in his late 40s by this time, he decides he really wants to plant his own food. He thinks that's a good idea. So he actually buys a house outside of Tokyo. Very little money, by the way, throughout his life, but he manages to scrape together enough to buy a plot of land and to actually do some farming. And this is what he writes about it. He says, stripping down to nothing. I don't know if that means he was actually naked or not, but could be. Stripping down to nothing, I tilled the dark earth with quiet determination, preparing the beds for eggplants and tomatoes. As sweat began to glisten on my skin, a soft breeze swept through, turning the moment almost blissful. There's something profoundly human in the life of a farmer, a life in harmony with the natural world, attuned to its rhythms and seasons. For those few hours, I had no worries, no distractions, only the steady pulse of labor, the feel of the earth, and the deep satisfaction that comes from honest physical work. It was, in the truest sense, a moment of peace. So this is quite poetic. It's this very strong feeling that in order to really be fulfilled, Seno'o felt, he had to have this direct connection to the earth, and farming was a way to do it. One of the, I'll mention a little bit about his wife in a few minutes, but one of the problems that he had in his marriage was that he was away from home a lot. And one of the reasons he was away from home is that he felt that in order to spread his Buddhist political message, he needed to get outside of Tokyo. He didn't want to just talk to people in Tokyo. He wanted to talk to farming communities. So he spent a lot of time traveling in the mountains all over Japan, talking to these small communities. And as I mentioned before, they weren't able to pay him very much because, these are small rural communities. They don't have a lot of money. So he was away from home a lot, and he wasn't bringing in money. This caused problems, as you can imagine, with his wife. She was not particularly happy with this part. So farming for him, though, becomes a kind of ethical practice. So the body's contact with soil, rhythm, and weight is an act of embodied attentiveness, reconciliation with material existence, and resistance in his mind to capitalist alienation, a way of getting away from the more sort of abstract labor of the factories or of the cities. So just as a comparative context here, there's a lot of influence of Tolstoy. And again, this is something I found quite striking when I read about this period in Japan. Tolstoy was massively influential, right, in a way that, sometimes I say Tolstoy was the first global figure, because in places like China and Japan, everyone was reading Tolstoy, not the novels, right, because they're too long. and most of them were not translated into Japanese. Rather, Tolstoy's essays. And if you know anything about Tolstoy, he writes a lot about the land, but also about spirituality. Tolstoy was, like Seno'o, a religious person on the margins of his own tradition. So Tolstoy was a Christian, but he was a very unorthodox Christian. But one of the things he talks a lot about is the importance of farming and material life as well. I also mentioned William Morris in there, who's a British socialist that Seno'o was influenced by. I'm actually wearing a William Morris shirt, so I was going to see if anyone picked that up, but now I've called it out. This is actually a shirt of William Morris's designs. He's probably more known for his designs than for his politics, but he's another figure who was quite influential in Japan at the time. All right, so the other sense that I mentioned is sound and speech. So Seno'o becomes quite good at giving speeches. As I mentioned, that's really what he does for most of his life, is he travels around and he gives talks. He was quite charismatic. He was a good speaker. But he also was someone who was attentive to the power of sound. Eventually, as I mentioned, Seno'o gets put into prison. And when he's in prison, oh, by the way, I didn't say this, but for the first year and a half when he's in prison, they actually don't give him any paper. And that almost kills him because he wants to write his diary, but they don't let him. And then finally they give him some paper and a pencil, and he tries to go back and fill in the year and a half that he missed. But when he's in prison, he picks up a lot of things, and the diary is very attentive to things like the sound of fellow prisoners, right? Moving around the prison, yelling at each other, making comments. So this is something that he really becomes quite attentive to. Speech is also very important within Buddhism. Buddhism from early times talks about the importance of right speech, which means something like being truthful, but not just that, also being compassionate and being careful in what you say to a person. So it's not simply being truthful, it's also being compassionate and careful. And then the third thing about sound that I think is important for Seno'o is language creating a kind of atmosphere. So language being social. And there's a scholar named Sarah Ahmed who talks about this as well. So to listen ethically is already a political act. To pay attention to sound and to speech is in itself ethical and, by extension, political. That's something that I think Seno'o also thinks about. This is an interesting image. I don't know if you're familiar with this costume, but this is actually a Korean men's traditional outfit. The reason that Seno'o is wearing this is because one of the things that happens after the earthquake is he becomes very conscious of the mistreatment of Koreans in Japan. And in fact, he goes to Korea and to China as well for a period and tries to sort of learn about China and Korea and sort of bring back that information to Japan, hopefully to help with the problem of the mistreatment of those two communities in Japan. But the image, again, I've colorized it. I don't know how I feel. It looks a little bit too vivid, but it's an interesting picture. This is him in Korea wearing Korean costume, again, as a kind of, I guess, as a kind of solidarity with the Korean people that he was trying to learn about. One of the concepts I talk about in my work, you can see it at the top there, is something called dharmic materialism. And this is just the idea that I mentioned before, that for Seno'o, coming out of the Nichiren tradition especially, Buddhism is about this world. It's not about an afterlife. Even awakening is about this world. And part of what this means is that in order to reach awakening, according to Seno'o, we need to transform this world. Not just our minds, but the world. Because the world and our minds are interconnected. If we think we can just transform our minds and that's it, we're missing a big part of it, right? So this basic idea I call dharmic materialism, he didn't make it up. I think it goes back to Nichiren, but he really develops it in an interesting way. This is a quote that I think summarizes that quite well. He says, praying to Shakyamuni Buddha, that's just the Buddha, right, the historical Buddha. Praying to the Buddha will not make your rice bins overflow. The Buddha himself taught that one must work diligently to earn a living. Okay, so work is important. But in our times, when a broken economic system ensures that labor does not bring for reward, the first fair reward, the first step is to reform the system itself. So it serves the welfare of all. We cannot hide behind empty slogans like poverty cannot catch up with industry. In other words, just work hard and everything will be okay. He says that's a lie. As the Buddha showed, when illness strikes, one must seek the proper cure and understand the root causes. This is actually a classical Buddhist idea. You have to understand the causes of suffering in order to eliminate suffering. The difference is he's applying it politically here and economically in a way that Buddhists don't usually. Likewise, he says, to protect our lives and our communities, devotion alone is not enough. Action and insight are indispensable. So that's, in some ways, a summation, I'd say, of Seno'o's radical Buddhism right there. All right, before I'm coming to the close here, but I do want to say a little bit more about his family. And this is, again, a colorized picture of him. When would this have been? I think all of his kids are there. I count 5. Yeah, there are 5 children there, plus his wife, Fumio, who's sitting down with the second youngest. So this would have been before he was arrested, but not long before. So when Seno'o was arrested and put in prison, his children were all quite young. And as you can imagine, this put a strain on his wife because even before he wasn't making a lot of money, but at least he was bringing in some. Now he's gone. He's actually in prison, and she has to fend for herself. So in the diary, Fumio becomes quite a sympathetic figure, I have to say. And Seno'o realizes that he's, not treating her very well sometimes. So this is an interesting part of it. But the thing that I wanted to mention at the top, the bottom part is Seno'o complaining about Fumio, because he's saying that she doesn't understand him. But, I read this and I'm like, well, I understand why she's unhappy with you. The one on the top, though, is also interesting because Seno'o was very opposed to the big department stores that were opening in Japan, had been around for, I guess, a generation, since the late 19th century. And one of these is Mitsukoshi. Of course, Mitsukoshi is still around. He was very opposed to these places because he saw them as symbols of consumer capitalism. I mean, this is like exactly what he doesn't like. However, his son, which one was it? Takashi. His second youngest son, Takashi, really wanted a tricycle. So what does Seno'o do? He buys a tricycle. And then he feels guilty for buying the tricycle. But it's interesting because the tension between him as a political activist and then him as a father. And in this case, the father wins out, right? Takashi really wanted a tricycle, even though he was opposed to going to Mitsukoshi. And by the way, probably paying a lot of money in those days for a tricycle, right? It would have been, I'm guessing, much more expensive relatively than today. But he does it. And then he starts to feel tension about it. But the fact that he does it shows you that the love of his son was stronger in that case than his political ideas. So I find that it's a nice, in some ways it's a nice story, although it caused him anxieties. This is actually a sketch that he did while he was in prison. You can see the prison. He was actually in Sugamo prison, which is one of the big prisons in Tokyo. And this was a prison that was used to house political prisoners. So everyone in the prison, pretty much everyone in the prison was Japanese, but they were people who the government felt were politically suspicious, people like Seno'o. So what was interesting is that when Seno'o was in the prison, he got to meet some very famous people, some very famous people, communists and otherwise, who had been rounded up by the police. One of the things that happened in prison that the government tried to do is they wanted the prisoners to confess. The word for this is tenko in Japanese, to turn. And so what they did was they used techniques to put immense pressure, psychological, sometimes physical pressure, on the prisoners so that they would reject their political ideas and embrace the imperial project. Seno'o doesn't do that, and this prolongs his stay in prison. He doesn't do it because he says, my vision is actually in support of the imperial project, but it's just a different version of it. So he ended up writing this long 40-page document, and the special police forces were reading it and saying, we don't understand this, we don't know what you're doing. And so it was an interesting clash. But as you can imagine, the prison experience was hard for someone who by this time, he's in his 50s, mid-50s. He's always been in ill health. He doesn't get a lot of food. He's treated quite poorly, as you can imagine, by the guards. So he made this sketch of his cell, and he wrote this little poem here. He says, at 53, I lie in this lonely prison infirmary, coughing up blood. Alone, I sit by the barred window near the impurity gate, that's outside, listening to the steady fall of May rain. Even a single cup of milk brings no comfort. Had it been fresh, it might have stirred memories of my youth chasing cows across sunlit fields. So I just put this in here because you get a sense of the nostalgia that he's feeling, but also the way he writes it in terms of the senses, right? Tasting the milk and then having this kind of nostalgia for running through the fields and in Okayama, I assume, back when he was young. All right, so this is my last slide that sort of summarizes, I think, these things I've been talking about, and that is to think about radical Buddhism, this sort of Buddhist political activism, not simply as a set of ideas, but as a kind of sensory critique. One of the aspects of this is what I've called in other writings dharmic materialism, which, as I say here, is simply grounded in attentiveness, in vulnerability, and the lived texture of everyday experience, in material reality, right, first and foremost, especially material reality for those who are on the margins rather than those who are on maybe the top of society. The second one, just sort of moving down, the idea of Buddhism as lived experience, and the word for One of the key words in classical Buddhism is pratītyasamutpāda. That's a Sanskrit word, which simply means the arising of conditions that leads to everything. So one of the basic Buddhist ideas is that everything happens because of causes. I mean, that's not a world-breaking idea. That's sort of true, right? But the Buddhists talk about this because they suggest that if you understand the causes that lead to suffering, then you can actually undercut those causes to eliminate suffering. So that's the reason why causation or pratītyasamutpāda is so important. Seno'o takes this a little bit further, though, to develop it into a critique of capitalism. And this is where I think he's the most radical, because other Buddhists at the time were talking a lot about Buddhist politics. They weren't really engaging with the economic system in the way that Seno'o does quite clearly. So what he argues is that industrial modernity distorts and dulls perception. So it has effects not just on our lives generally, but on our bodies, right? It affects our bodies. So Seno'o advances a mode of life in which ethical transformation begins with a refinement of the senses. So the senses have to play a role in thinking about capitalism and maybe even trying to undercut capitalism. And then last but not least, the fourth one down there, this is a fancy word, but the phenomenology of interdependence, which simply means that for Seno'o, Buddhism is about the way that we relate to other human beings and the natural world, right? So we can never step out of that, just like we can never step out of our bodies. One of the things he's trying to do there is to push back against some tendencies in some forms of Buddhism to make it all about the individual or even all about the mind. And Seno'o pushes back against that. He says it can't be about the individual because we're always embedded in society. And it can't just be about the mind because we can't escape our body and our senses. We need to deal with those. And that's where I'm going to wrap it up. So thank you for paying attention. And yeah, the floor, I guess, is open to questions, comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shields. Let's transition into the Q&A session. So feel free to, offer any comments or questions you may have, or ask for clarifications, since this is a new topic and we might not be familiar with the character of Seno'o Giro, but I think we got a pretty good idea what radical Buddhism here means. So please ask the students to give you a mic, and they'll bring it to you, and you can ask your question or offer a comment.
When Seno'o was in prison and then he came back after like the year and a half of not writing, did his writing style or kind of thinking process change in that time?
That's a very good question. Is this the one that works or the one that doesn't work? Can you hear me? It works? Okay. That's a great question, because I think Seno'o in prison, and I struggle with this and trying to interpret it, because sometimes it does seem like he's shifting his politics again. In terms of, let me just answer, in terms of writing style, no. His writing style is the same. He really writes basically whatever's coming into his head, he's putting down on paper. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to the handwritten. It was all handwritten, of course. What I read was the typeset, which made it much easier, but I didn't get a sense of his handwriting. But in terms of his thought, he does shift a little bit during the time in prison to, it seems like he's trying to find a bridge between his ideas and what the police inspectors want him to say. And there have been people, other interpreters, who have said that he actually did convert. I don't think that's true. I just think he's trying to do both things somehow. He's trying to figure out a way to make them happy without giving up his ideas entirely. By the way, after the war, he kind of shifts back, if anything, to an even more radical perspective. So I think during the time in prison, he's sort of having trouble maybe figuring out what the best method is for him to explain himself, and also maybe trying to get out of prison, right, without completely converting like some of the others. There's famous cases of two other communist leaders who converted entirely to the imperial project, and were obviously criticized by some of their colleagues for that. But I mean, if I were being tortured, I would probably do that too, I think, right? So, to some extent, you have to consider the pressures, the immense pressures that they were feeling, people like Seno'o were feeling. So, in some ways, it's amazing he didn't actually do that. He just wrote these 40-page documents that the police just didn't understand what he was trying to do. Thank you. That's a question here. I don't know what the order is. Raise your hands high so the mic people can see them. There's one here too, right?
Oh shit. No, it's like kind of like a question, kind of like a comment, but
Okay.
it made me think about like now, like with like this like post-capitalist society, AI being controlled by like all of these billionaires, like how does this radical Buddhism, in a sense, because I feel like a lot of youth feel very powerless in this situation. So, like, how does this? Could we translate this into our lives, dealing with something where we don't have control, but we want better for ourselves and for the world and others?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a hard one to answer, but let me tell you that part of the reason I'm continuing with this work, I sort of fell into this a few years ago because I read a book, a very famous book by my friend who I'm actually meeting in a couple of days in Kyoto, Brian Victoria, a senior scholar who wrote a book called Zen at War, which became quite famous because basically in that book he talks about, really the first time in English at least, how Japanese Buddhists during the war period, during this period, were overwhelmingly in support of the imperial project and capitalism and so on. And I read that book and I got very depressed. But then in that book, I actually saw he had mentioned Seno'o Giro as an exception. And I said, aha, that's the guy. I want to study this guy. But more recently, I've been contacted by mostly younger Buddhists or people who are interested in Buddhism in the US who have read something I've written about Seno'o and have been kind of inspired by it because they're thinking about the same things, right? Even though the context is different, obviously there's no AI, but you could argue that the stakes are higher now, certainly with the environment, right? But also with the way that technology seems to be out of many people's control. And I think one of the things Buddhism gives us, maybe not just radical Buddhism, but maybe Buddhism, is a lot of, it pays a lot of attention to attention. I know that's a weird way to put it, but a lot of Buddhism is about paying attention to your body and to your mind and to your thoughts and to your emotions. And I think there's something really powerful about that at a time where we're told, or maybe we're forced in some way by technologies to not pay attention to things, right? You've heard about the attention economy, right? That our attention has become a profit-making opportunity, which is kind of an extreme version of the sort of things that were happening in the 1920s and 30s. So I think there is something to that, both in terms of Buddhism more generally, but I think also the idea that Buddhism has something to say about, for example, social injustice or gender inequality, which to me seems obvious, but there are, I've talked to some Buddhists who say, no, Buddhism has nothing to do with politics. But if Buddhism is about paying attention to suffering and relieving suffering, it has to have a political aspect, right? So I think there is something there, but it's a tough question, right? Because it's a big question. But I've been inspired by the fact that so many people have been approaching me and saying, hey, we want to learn more about this, and so I'm putting together a website that is trying to compile, not just in Japan, but in other countries as well, where you have similar kind of movements and ideas. But thank you. Question now.
I just want to go off the first comment, and if I'm not sure, but if his writings were on different sheets of paper, would it
notebooks
be possible that if you went back to radical Buddhism, like, or the radical sect, like the what he wrote during the time in prison, was maybe he's kind of hiding the instead of like converting or anything like that.
Yeah, that's possible. And some scholars have said that he didn't actually mean some of the things he wrote. But I question that because he spends so much time writing about things that he really didn't need to write about. Right. So again, the police inspectors were basically saying, just write a confession, and then he would write 40 or 50 pages. He didn't need to do that, right? So that's where it's interesting to me.
Like I was wondering, because like maybe he was writing his diary, but like the things that he wanted to write about, but also kind of writing the other stuff that looked like he was converting, like just in case the police find it.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I mean, the police obviously knew he was writing, but they allowed him to do it. I don't think they felt, because he had no way of getting that writing out of the prison, so they allowed him to keep writing once they gave him the paper. Interestingly, though, let me tell you this little story, is that after he died, no one knew about his notebooks except his immediate family. One of his sons, not Takashi, the tricycle son, but the elder son, actually took his father's diaries and hid them under the floor in their house because he was worried that even in the 1960s that these might cause trouble for the family, right? So thankfully, one scholar went there to the house and said, "Hey, did your father write anything?" And the son said, "Yeah, he did. It's over there under the under the floor." And then the scholar pulled out all of these manuscripts and then eventually typeset them. So,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shields.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. I don't know if this is on. Oh, there
Yes,
we go.
I can hear you.
I didn't know anything about it. Just generally speaking, what I wonder about is why would he call himself a Buddhist instead of calling himself a communist? Because, you mentioned that he was promoting revolution. I don't hear that. Maybe Nichiren,
Yeah, exactly.
but not original Buddhism. But maybe I'm not sure if that was with weapons.
It was.
It was.
Sorry, say that again?
Was it with weapons that he
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that.
But no, I was just thinking, it just seems like his political and social concerns just seem to fall in line very much with Karl Marx, and especially he was a farmer, and the natural life. I don't know a lot about Karl Marx, but I believe that he felt a major problem was industrialization, and that natural work, the loss of natural work, and natural
alienation,
trade between people. It seemed like this was similar to what he was promoting and what affected him. So I'm just wondering, did he ever call himself a communist, and why not? Because it seems like he's very much in that, usually enlightenment or awakening, you usually think in terms of this, it's radical and certainly directed towards this awakening event. I don't know if he felt he had that, but anyway, I'm just wondering about that. Yeah.
That's a great question. So a lot of things to say about that. Seno'o resisted calling himself a communist. He did not join the Communist Party until 2 years before he died. So he was actually very older, like toward the end of his life. And part of the reason was he saw what was happening in the Soviet Union. He didn't like it. And I give him a lot of credit for that, because even though he was inspired by the Russian Revolution, like a lot of leftists in Japan, he quickly saw that things were not going in the direction he had hoped. If anything, if you were to put Seno'o in a political category, I'd call him a little bit closer to an anarchist than a communist, in the sense that he was very critical of state forms. And this is also where he disagrees with some of Marx's ideas about the necessity of the state, even though Marx says the state will disappear. But Seno'o was more inclined to something more like a Tolstoyan, or if you know, Kropotkin or Bakunin, some of these Russian anarchist writers were actually much more popular in Japan than Marx was, partly because Marx's writings took a long time to come to Japan. They really only came to Japan after the Russian Revolution, by which point Japanese socialism had been around for 20 years. So the interesting thing about the left wing in Japan in the early 20th century is it's very eclectic, right? A lot of them are Christian. A lot of the early socialists in Japan were Christian as well. So you have this heavy Christian socialism. You have a lot of anarchist writings. You have different kinds of socialism, William Morris, for example. And then eventually Marx becomes the dominant form. But Seno'o didn't really like the kind of communist model. In terms of revolution, his idea was, and this is why he wanted to emphasize Buddhism, he thought Buddhism presented a compassionate element, maybe a humanistic element that he saw sometimes lacking with justification in some secular leftist ideologies. So again, he was looking at the Soviet Union, he was looking at some of the parties in Japan who he felt were dangerously not paying attention enough to basic compassion and dignity of the individual. So this is where he felt Buddhism could actually, in a way, sort of soften the revolution. The question of violence is a tricky one. He's never really clear about how he feels about that, right? Never really clear. And the police question him on that, but in some ways, he's justified in saying, I never stated that I was arguing for a violent revolution. But he's kind of implying that there needs to be a massive transformation. So I think his ideal was that he would join with the secular leftist parties and he would make sure that they were not doing horrible things in the course of the revolution. That I think was his, maybe naive, but I think that was his idea. But he always thought of himself as a Buddhist first and foremost. That was the key thing. But he did think Buddhism implied for him something like a radical politics. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael Tuchek, Asian Studies here at TUJ. One of the things I feel when I hear the story of Seno'o Giro, whose existence I did not know, in his diaries, does he ever say that he's copying someone? Because so many of the incidents that you've discussed are reflected or seem to be reflections of actions that were taken by others either a decade or so before. You take the fascination with Tolstoy. You see that in Tokutomi Roka or in Musakoji Saneatsu. Musakoji Saneatsu establishes his own agricultural village and acts out like a farmer in Miyazaki Prefecture in 1918. Then we have 20 years later this farmer passage. Also, in terms of, he was at Ichiko in what years? Because one of the
I have to do the math here. Yeah. He dropped out in 1909.
Okay, so he wasn't there for Tokutomi Roka's famous speech about Kotoko Shusui, the great socialist anarchist. So it seems as though, does he ever say, okay, yeah, I'm replicating the actions of others? Because so many of these things, I hear echoes. I teach Japanese history of the time period, and it seems like he's doing from a Shin Buddhist point of view. And to be fair, in terms of Tenko, most of those who did Tenko converted to Shin Buddhism. They didn't actually go completely into the imperial way. They were saved by Shin Buddhist priests who had come in.
That's right, yeah.
does he mention others
Oh,
as
yeah.
models for himself?
I mean, half of the diaries are him reflecting on what he's reading. And he was, let me say, when he was at Ikko, he was, the headmaster was Nitobe Inazo. So he was getting a tremendously broad, wide sort of education, but also framed as in the sense of, like a lot of intellectuals, these are ways to make Japan strong by borrowing and adopting and bringing in all these ideas. And so Seno'o, yeah, he's never hesitant to talk about his sources, right? And he's borrowing from a lot, like Tolstoy, he's very clear on, Tokutomi Roka as well, like all of these figures, they each, every time he reads a book, he talks about it in the diary, and he says what he learned from it, but he's also, you know, he's free to say, oh, I didn't actually like this part, or I disagreed with this. So yeah, he's really borrowing and is very eclectic in bringing together different intellectual. Like I said before, he was not someone who was doctrinarily connected to a Buddhist sect or to a particular philosopher or anything like that. He was taking in really as much as he could and ingesting it and then creating this, what I think in the end is a quite unique package, but absolutely it's borrowing from all kinds of sources. And he's not afraid to say that. You know, one of the things I wish he did a little bit more of is to cite his sources directly. I had to translate his lengthy essay last year. I shouldn't say I had to, I chose to. And in that essay, he has about 150 references, but he doesn't actually, he's not a scholar, so he's not actually citing. And so I had to track these down, which was difficult. But yeah, he's like dropping names of all of those figures you mentioned, basically any major writer, intellectual in Japan or the West during that period, he's reading them and he's taking something from them, for sure.
And just to follow up, was he in communication with Kagawa Toyohiko, the great Christian who has a very similar disease-ridden life of social activism and eventual imprisonment for it?
Yeah, they only met late, but when they did, they bonded over their very remarkably similar life stories. But yeah, I'd say some of his closest friends were Christian, were sort of radical Christians, which partly is because there were a lot of early Christian socialists. So that was a movement that he was quite, in fact, one of the slogans that the organization came up with early on was, carry the Buddha on our backs and go to the streets. And of course, they're taking the Christian socialist idea of carrying the cross. But it seems strange when you talk about carrying the Buddha on your backs. It doesn't seem, I don't know, it loses a little bit something there. But he's deliberately borrowing that from the Christian socialist idea.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? Is this working?
It is.
Yeah. I'd like to actually ask you about what you just said, Professor Shields, at the end, that Seno'o Giro was studying under Inazo Nitobe, because I have some interest in Inazo Nitobe's work, especially when it comes to him influencing Watsuji Tetsuro.
Okay, yeah.
Right, and I'm interested, like, what influence did Seno'o Giro receive from Inazo Nitobe, and was he in any way connected to Tetsuro Watsuji or anyone else from the Kyoto school, like Tanabe perhaps, or maybe even Nishida?
Yeah, I get that question a lot because I've also written about the Kyoto school in my earlier career. But in fact, so this shows you the kind of different realms that he was living in. I mean, he was, at some level, he was an intellectual, but he didn't go to he never went to university, right? I mean, he dropped out he didn't even finish high school. So he's traveling in kind of different circles. The only member of the Kyoto school that he mentions reading is Nishida. He does read and inquire into the good, Sen no Kinkyu. He doesn't really know what to do with it. He finds it probably, too philosophical, a little too abstract. He reads it, he's like, okay, well, it is what it is, but it doesn't really touch him in the way that, he gets a lot of his ideas from literature, but also from political writings, more so than from the kind of philosophical work that the Kyoto school was doing. As far as I know, he never met Watsuji Tatsuro, who I don't think studied directly under Nitobe, did he? He was probably influenced by. Was he?
Was at in Tokyo High School, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Could have been.
Where Inazo Nitobe was a headmaster, I think. Yeah.
Because they would be, Watsuji and Seno'o would be about the same age, so I'll have to look into that to see if they did overlap a bit. But
And how about Natsume Soseki? Watsuji was very influenced by Soseki later in life, and he actually picked up a lot of his latter work that he develops in Rinrigaku from Soseki's influence. We mentioned Dostoevsky, for example, Soseki being like this great Japanese writer from the era. Any such other figures, if not Soseki, someone else maybe in Japan?
He's reading mostly the proletarian writers of the time, and I don't know if he even mentions Natsume Soseki in as far as I can recall. So he's reading more of the writers who were experimenting with sort of proletarian literature, for better or worse, some of them, but mostly those. And then a lot of Western, like he was reading Dostoevsky, he was reading Tolstoy, he was reading Walt Whitman, he was reading all kinds of stuff. So, some Japanese literature, but maybe not the major figures that we would associate with today. I think Tanizaki he's maybe reading a little bit of, at one point, but not Natsume Soseki, I don't think.
And lastly, your 4 concluding points, the third one on sensory critique of capitalism, but not as much as capitalism itself, but the last part, advances a mode of life in which ethical transformation, so the emphasis would be on ethical transformation here, begins with the refinement of the senses. Could you clarify a little bit more how's that supposed to happen? I'm really curious.
Yeah, maybe begins is too strong. Maybe is interconnected with the senses. So this is one of the things I was trying to sort of get at, was how his philosophy and his politics and his religion are filtered through his body, right? Either through the illness that disrupts his life course, through the earthquake, which becomes such a sensual shock to him, through his family, right? So maybe it's not so much that ethics emerges from this, but it's this sort of phenomenological approach to ethics, which doesn't think of ethics as being about rationality first and foremost, as kind of embodied experience. So, you think about people like Merleau-Ponty, right, obviously, or even like Levinas or someone like that as well, which I didn't bring in here, but I think that's sort of parallel streams in later Western philosophy that kind of get to. And this is something that I think Buddhists have always done to some extent, is think about ethics in terms of phenomenology.
Thank you. So, any last questions or comments perhaps before we wrap it up for tonight? I guess that's going to be it for tonight. Well, thank you all for coming, and let's give a round of applause for Professor Shields.
Thank you.
Feel free to stick around and ask questions, or just introduce yourself to Professor Shields if you'd like, and ask anything. Thank you all.